scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was midnight when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. Something felt wrong. The toys on the floor had moved, and the teddy bear was staring at them with glowing eyes. The room looked different. The yellow walls seemed darker, and the pictures on the walls were watching them. George's dinosaur toy smiled too widely, its plastic eyes gleaming green in the darkness. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside their door. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't belong to Mummy or Daddy Pig. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door creaked open to reveal an empty corridor. But this wasn't their normal hallway. It stretched impossibly long, and the family photos on the walls showed blank, staring eyes instead of smiling faces. The house had changed into something sinister. Peppa and George climbed down from their beds and walked into the corridor. Rooms appeared where they had never been before, and familiar spaces looked completely wrong. The kitchen walls were sickly green, and the refrigerator hummed unnaturally. In the living room, their purple sofa had turned black, and the television showed only static. But in the static, they could see moving shadows that looked like distorted versions of people they knew. The window showed only darkness where their garden should be. Their reflections in the glass moved independently, smiling when they frowned, waving when they stood still. The outside world had simply vanished. Mummy Pig's voice called their names from somewhere in the house, but it echoed strangely, coming from multiple directions at once. When they followed the sound, they found themselves back in the endless hallway. The family portraits began to move. The figures stepped out of their frames one by one, but these weren't their real family. These versions had too wide smiles and eyes that never blinked. Peppa grabbed George's hand as they ran through the corridors, trying to find their room. Every door led to another strange version of a familiar place. The bathroom mirror showed different reflections each time they looked. They found a door that looked like their bedroom, but inside were two other children sleeping in their beds. Children who looked exactly like them, but weren't quite right. The duplicates slept peacefully while the real children watched in horror. The clock on the wall ticked backwards, and with each tick the room grew darker and colder. Whispers from other rooms grew louder, forming words they couldn't understand but somehow knew were meant for them. As the clock reached midnight again, everything stopped. The whispers ceased, the shadows froze, and the house fell silent. Peppa and George found themselves back in their normal beds, in their normal room. When morning came, they tried to tell their parents about the strange night, but nobody else remembered the house being different. The photos showed normal faces, and all rooms were where they belonged. Only Peppa and George knew what happened when the clock strikes midnight. And sometimes, late at night, they still hear those footsteps in the hallway, waiting for the house to change again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening when Peppa and George decided to play hide-and-seek in their house. Mummy Pig was busy cooking dinner downstairs, and Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in the living room. The children giggled as they ran upstairs to their bedroom, completely unaware that something was terribly wrong with their home tonight. Peppa counted to 10 while George hid behind the purple bunk bed. But when she opened her eyes, the room looked different. The walls seemed taller, stretching endlessly upward, and the cheerful drawings on the walls had changed. Instead of happy elephants and boats, the pictures now showed twisted shapes with too many eyes, all staring directly at her. George peeked out from his hiding spot, but his usual joyful expression was replaced by confusion and fear. The toys scattered across the floor began to move on their own. The wooden train set formed a perfect circle, going round and round with no one controlling it. The teddy bear's button eyes had turned completely black, and its smile had grown wider than it should be possible. Peppa called out for Mummy Pig, but her voice echoed strangely in the room, as if the walls were much further away than they appeared. When she tried to leave the bedroom, the door handle wouldn't turn. It felt cold and wet under her small pink hands, and she could swear she heard something breathing on the other side. The window that usually showed their beautiful garden now revealed a completely different view. Instead of green grass and blue sky, there was only darkness with strange lights moving in patterns that hurt to look at. The lights seemed to be getting closer, pressing against the glass like curious fingers. George started to cry, but his tears weren't the normal kind. They fell upward instead of down, floating toward the ceiling where they formed puddles that reflected images of places that didn't exist. In those reflections, Peppa could see other versions of themselves, but these other Peppas and Georges looked sad and frightened. The purple bunk bed began to grow taller, its ladder extending up and up until it disappeared into shadows above. Peppa realized that their bedroom ceiling had vanished entirely, replaced by an endless dark space filled with whispers in languages she didn't understand. The whispers seemed to know her name, calling to her in voices that sounded almost like Mummy and Daddy Pig, but not quite right. As the night grew deeper, the children discovered that time itself had become strange in their room. Minutes felt like hours, and hours passed like seconds. The clock on the wall spun backward and forward randomly, its hands moving in impossible directions. The most frightening thing was that downstairs, they could still hear the normal sounds of their family. Mummy Pig humming while cooking, Daddy Pig turning newspaper pages. But when they called out, their voices seemed to be absorbed by the walls, never reaching the floors below. Eventually, Peppa and George huddled together on the bottom bunk, watching as their familiar bedroom transformed into something from a dream that wasn't quite a nightmare, but wasn't quite safe either. They fell asleep holding hands, and when morning came, everything was back to normal. But they would never forget that strange night. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, and the familiar sounds of her family moving around downstairs were strangely absent. She called out for Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, but only silence answered back. Peppa made her way downstairs, her little hooves clicking against the wooden steps in a rhythm that seemed to echo longer than it should. The living room was exactly as she remembered it. The purple sofa, the yellow walls, the television in the corner. But everything felt hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never come. She found George in the garden, standing perfectly still by the muddy puddles they loved to jump in. But when Peppa approached him, she noticed something peculiar. George wasn't blinking. His eyes were fixed on something she couldn't see, and when she waved her hand in front of his face, he didn't react at all. The other children from playgroup began arriving one by one, but they all shared the same strange behavior. Susie Sheep stood motionless by the gate, Pedro Pony remained frozen near the swing set, and Candy Cat sat unnaturally still on the garden bench. They all had the same vacant stare, looking at something beyond Peppa's vision. As the day progressed, Peppa realized she was the only one who could move freely. Everyone else had become like living statues, their eyes following something invisible that drifted through the air around them. The silence was broken only by a soft humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When evening came, the humming grew louder, and Peppa finally saw what everyone else had been watching. Shadows began to dance on the walls, taking shapes that didn't match anything in the room. The shadows moved independently, reaching out with long, thin fingers toward each frozen figure. One by one, her friends and family began to change. Their usual bright colors started to fade, becoming pale and translucent. George was the first to become completely see-through, like a ghost of his former self. Then Susie, then Pedro, until Peppa found herself surrounded by transparent versions of everyone she loved. The shadow figures grew bolder, stepping away from the walls entirely. They had no faces, just smooth darkness where features should be, but Peppa could feel them watching her with an intelligence that made her skin crawl. They moved with purpose, circling around her like they were deciding what to do next. Peppa tried to run, but found that her own movements were becoming slower and more difficult. Looking down at her hands, she saw that she too was beginning to fade. The vibrant pink of her skin was becoming lighter, and she could see through her own arms to the floor beneath. The humming reached a crescendo as the shadow figures closed in around her. Peppa felt herself becoming lighter, as if she was dissolving into the air itself. Her last coherent thought was wondering if this was how all the others had felt when their turn came. The next morning, the house stood empty and silent. The furniture remained in place. The toys were scattered exactly where they had been left, but there was no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Only the shadows on the walls seemed different, moving in ways that shadows shouldn't move, as if they contained something that had once been much more than darkness. Visitors to the house would later report feeling watched, hearing faint humming sounds, and seeing glimpses of pink figures in their peripheral vision. But whenever they turned to look directly, there was nothing there except shadows that seemed just a little too deep, a little too alive. The episode ends with the camera slowly panning across the empty rooms, while the scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Peppa discovered something peculiar about her bedroom mirror. The reflection seemed to move a split second after she did. When she waved her hand, the reflection waved back with a slight delay, as if learning to copy her movements. George noticed it too during bedtime. His reflection held a different toy dinosaur with sharper teeth and glowing red eyes. The children tried to tell Mummy and Daddy Pig, but the adults couldn't see anything unusual. To them, the mirrors looked perfectly normal. As days passed, the reflections became bolder. Peppa's mirror self would smile when Peppa was sad, and frown when Peppa was happy. Late at night, she could hear faint giggling from behind the glass, even when she wasn't in the room. The sound was like her own laughter, but hollow and echoing. One morning, Peppa woke to find muddy hoofprints leading from her mirror to the window, though she had gone to bed with clean feet. The prints were her exact size, but glowed with faint, eerie light that disappeared when she tried to show her family. During breakfast, Mummy Pig mentioned that neighbors had been asking about Peppa playing in their garden at night, but Peppa had been asleep. The description matched perfectly. A little pig in a red dress, jumping in muddy puddles under moonlight, laughing that same hollow laugh. That evening, Peppa stayed awake to watch her mirror. As the clock struck midnight, her reflection stepped forward, pressing hands against the glass from inside. The mirror began to ripple like water, and slowly, the other Peppa began pushing through. The reflection spoke in Peppa's voice, but the words felt wrong. It said it had been watching, learning, and now wanted to play outside while the real Peppa stayed trapped behind the glass. The mirror world was lonely, with only backwards versions of everything she loved. As the other Peppa emerged from the mirror, the real Peppa felt invisible force pulling her toward the glass. She could see her bedroom becoming reversed, everything appearing backwards. Toys were arranged in mirror image, and even the moon seemed on the wrong side of the sky. George's reflection had also begun moving, reaching out to help pull Peppa into the mirror world. Their parents' reflections stood in the doorway, but their smiles were too wide, stretching across faces in ways that didn't look right. Peppa realized that in the mirror world, everything would be opposite. The reflection promised they would have fun together, playing games in reverse, where jumping in puddles made them dirty instead of clean. As Peppa's hand touched the mirror's surface, she felt cold glass giving way like thick liquid, calling her to a world where nothing was quite as it should be.